So in the US, there are several milestones that you pass in youth. At 16, you can drive. At 18, you can vote. 21, drink alcohol. And kind of the final stage of youth is at 25. Anyone have any idea what that is? The American says rent a car. Yes. Rent a car. Now, you might be able to, with some companies, rent a car before 25. It often costs a lot of money. The reason for that is that car insurance is expensive. It goes down and then kind of levels off a little after 25. And that's because younger drivers, they make riskier decisions. They get in more accidents. And so the reason behind this, which is related to APIs, I promise, is brain development. And Jean Piaget came up with these stages in the early 1900s, and then others did some research and realized that the prefrontal cortex that helps you make good decisions does not fully form until 25 or perhaps a few years later. For some of us, maybe still developing now. And so here we are, the modern API now is 25 years old. The modern API can now rent a car. Its prefrontal cortex is potentially reaching full development. And so what we need for APIs then is a model much like this. But instead of cognitive development, we have this new theory, this modern API development theory. And so what we'll do over the next few minutes is go through these stages that I've identified and what we learned at these stages and what we can take as we're continuing this final stage here. And so the first one we'll go back to is 25 years ago, this dot-com stage. But in Piaget's model, this is where a baby starts to understand its body and the senses. You might see them just like stare at their hands at this point. And so it's the really, really early developments, which takes us back to some of the first APIs. Does anyone know which of these came first? I hear some eBays. Any Amazons? Amazon was 2002, so 23 years ago. Then eBay, you're right, 2000, we're coming up on that 25th anniversary. And then Salesforce was a few months before that. And what each of these did then was to be able to get input from users and bring it into their system. You could add leads to Salesforce. You could add auctions to eBay. Amazon, I think you could get some products, but really it was about adding users to Amazon. And Salesforce here talked about these legacy applications and that you could pull them in using XML APIs in their new software as a service world. And at that time, the common arrangement, you had service-oriented architecture, you had these very defined ways of accessing data with SOAP and XML. And because of that, you had these kind of assumptions. You might be able to use anything, but there was kind of these tools that you probably were using. It was difficult to be able to develop in that time frame. But, of course, some did. This is a company that's enabled anyone who is a bookseller. Imagine yourself selling books in 2000, and you have this stack of books. Well, using their software, you could go and you could scan your back catalog and then suddenly be available to all of these new marketplaces. And that was happening, of course, via API and enabling these people who otherwise wouldn't have had access to it or had to do a lot of manual work. And perhaps not a coincidence that Monsoon is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year as well. And so, at this time where APIs were brand new, I think the lesson that still is worth thinking about today is to allow for many inputs. And specifically here, it's those three companies and the others that came after them knew the data that users wanted to share and then allowed developers to enable those users. And that led us into this really exciting mashup era. And in Piaget's model, this would be where you see a lot of play and experimentation and learning to use symbols. And one of the first things that really ignited that mashup era was Google Maps. Not Google Maps API, maps.google.com as it looked on its launch day in early '05. You could move the map around, zoom in, no need for a full page refresh. So it was exciting times and people played around with it. But then they started asking questions, especially technical people like Paul Rademacher, who was playing with Google Maps in one window and looking for an apartment in another window. And he said, why do I have to click on each of these to figure out where it is? Why can't it just show up on the map? And so he and others reverse engineered JavaScript, the JavaScript that powered Google Maps, and created the first mashups. And then it was maps everywhere. Maps probably where they didn't even belong, right? And lots of data that we started to add to be able to put on a map. And it didn't take long then for Google to realize that they needed to have an official API, which came, I mean, it's amazing. It was like March to June that all of this happened in 2005. And then others, Adrian Holabody, used crime data in Chicago and put that on maps in Chicago crime. And also around that time, programmable web launched. John Musser founded it. I later joined as the first editor of programmable web. And at the end of 2005, and I'm sure John had looked for every last API that existed, there were 136 in the programmable web catalog. And as that grew over time, we noticed new things, the ways that the tools that they used. You saw REST, you saw RESTful APIs, and definitely JSON, and a lot more flexibility. And so more things could be built in this era. And so then the number of APIs grew as the desire for being able to show things, being able to have new outputs to be able to put our creativity into. And so if you know the data that users want in the mashup era, then you can provide that data and developers will distribute it. And that's why you'd upload your Flickr photo and could show it in your blog sidebar, or you could go onto a movie review site and see your Netflix queue. All of these things in the mashup era. Exciting times that then brought us into the mobile era, or you might even call it the business era. And in Piaget's model, this is when things get logical. Children are more practical, and those thinking skills emerge, but there's still kind of trouble with being hypothetical. And we'll see how that impacts it. Of course, the mobile era, driven by the iPhone and the apps that came from that, and this was a whole new API consumer that we hadn't even considered before. And new apps that came out of this. Instagram, of course, hugely popular, but you had people, remember mashup era was just right before, you had people saying, but I want to upload my Flickr and have it go to Instagram, or have my Instagram things go to Flickr. And so, developers being developers, reverse engineering the traffic that goes between Instagram servers in your app, and you have this was on Programmable Web, broke the story of this fully featured but totally unpublished API that people then started to use. Instagram wasn't only an API provider or even accidental API provider, they were also a consumer. A lot of the early Instagram usage was built off of the Twitter network. And so you could go into Instagram and find your Twitter friends there until you couldn't, until Twitter shut that off. And that is notable to me because that's one of the first times I remember mainstream people talking about APIs. Even if they weren't saying API, they were saying, I want to find my friends on this app. And so if the mashup era, everything is a map, then certainly in the mobile era, everything's an app, but we all know that that means everything is an API. And that really was everything. You had the API as a company trend that continues now. This was notable then, that you have these communications companies or finance, even Google Maps that was big in the mashup era, then says, whoa, we can charge for this now. We can have all these different ways of being able to use this. And then I went to Amsterdam on the other side of the North Sea and talked about the new API at this time. And that was apps, partners, and income, the things that you can get from APIs in this mobile business era. And John Musser identified these business models. And if you go to apibusinessmodels.com, you can see sort of it in the tail end of this mobile era and all the ways that he drilled down. If you look at that, that's still, these are the core business models, and the ways that he identified are still relevant today, even if the logos that are attached to the examples aren't. And then we started seeing these API conferences like the one we're at today. And the slide that would come up inevitably on many of those of the iceberg, the public APIs on top and all of the internal APIs below, and the ways that we were starting to build software with APIs. And so, if we had allowing for inputs, allowing for outputs, now we are recognizing the value of those inputs and outputs. And we understand what users want to accomplish, and they're telling us we want this feature. We know what they value. So we're building APIs and building APIs without any ability to think hypothetically about what would happen if we build all these APIs, which leads us to not that long ago, the specification era, which could actually just straight up steal the name from Piaget's model of the formal operational stage. This is where you start to be hypothetical and abstract and can think about what can we do when everything is an API? And what should we do? And how can we identify those? And so you saw these formats get released, and the industry rallied around OpenAPI. And you saw ways to automate, tools like Postman, where it starts as a Chrome extension to make API calls and turns into this app and really platform. A company I've advised, API-Matic, it started as a PhD thesis on code generation and became ways to automate SDKs because we now have these descriptions of these APIs. And many, many, many tools on openapi.tools. And this idea, there was a whole API design track this morning, this idea of design first, that if we're going to describe these APIs, maybe we should think about what we're actually building before we build it. And can we use tooling to be able to automate, like Spectral here, to be able to say that we have some consistency between these. So starting to organize and standardize those inputs and outputs. But even more so, if we're doing our job, if we've learned enough from the spec stage, then we understand why it matters before we build it. And the why becomes really important in this new stage that we're all defining together. And this is that point where the prefrontal cortex starts to develop, where you have improved planning and decision making. And that's going to be really important because, as we've been hearing all day today, and we will hear all day tomorrow, and talk about in the coffee breaks, this is a moment that requires software that makes decisions. So we need the prefrontal cortex to be fully developed in our API programs. And a big word for me this year, and I think many of us here, has been MCP and the ways that we can provide that context, which puts the C in MCP, right? And this is also not particularly new, this desire to have the why understood. And so one example I can give you from my time at Zapier was that we had many ways to be able to integrate. At the time I joined, it was less than 1,000. There's multiple thousands now, but at that time I would go to an event like this and someone would say, you know what you should do? There's all those open API descriptions that we have out now. So you go and you just find all those, you bring them in, and you just turn those into Zapier integrations. Boom, done, you've got thousands now. You only have the 1,000 or 750 now. You'll have so many more. And that sounded like a great idea if all we wanted to do was grow the platform, grow that number. But the problem, and this was something I know Kristen mentioned in her talk this morning, endpoints are not always use cases. In fact, they're usually not. It might be multiple calls that you have to make to be able to get the end result that you're going for. And after being told what we should do a number of times, I gave a talk at API Spec conference about what's missing from OpenAPI. Described that. Clearly others have noticed as well. And so now we have a way to describe the way endpoints or entire APIs interact. So Arazo could be this missing piece that tells us how we can design these workflows. MCP might be a piece of that. All of the agent-to-agent stuff we're talking about, if we can explain why it matters, then we can start to piece together this next stage. And I think API design will likely change a lot. This moment probably does need something different. Maybe endpoints should look more like use cases. What does that change if that's the way that we're building these APIs? And I would point out that we have a new API consumer now, in much the same way that we did in the mobile stage. So what did we see when we had a new consumer before that we can learn from? Maybe not the crazy growth that is not tracked, or you end up with the zombies, right? Like, how can we learn from those? And I think at this stage that we are, it's way too early to know for sure what our lesson is here. But again, I think if we look at the points that we've had along the way here, that knowing why the inputs and outputs matter are more important now than they've ever been. And I think if you look back, they've been important all along the way. Most of our work, and I mean this is every developer's work, but also I imagine most of the work for you is not technical details, but it's unpacking those use cases, being able to figure out why the things matter. And so, you want to know the stage you're at now? We're definitely all going together to that context stage. But some of you might not be at that point in your programs right now, and that's okay. The brain does continue to grow after 25. Synapses are firing and neurons getting connected. I hope some from this talk. Definitely for me throughout the day, that was the case. And there are things to learn from. At an API conference, if there's a Jeff Bezos quote, it's probably going to be, everything needs to be an API, your organization needs to. But I think there's a better quote that we can pull from when he was asked about how do you figure out what's happening in the future. And he said, a better question is what's not going to change in the next 10 years. And so we can all look at what's happened the last 25 and use that to figure out how to make the better decisions. If we know at the .com stage that things were limited, there was a strict stack, but as we moved up to that mashup stage, it was about not just the inputs, but also the outputs, and being able to enable flexible experimentation. And some of you might still be making this work into the kind of biz-focused era of mobile where you understand the value of those inputs and outputs, especially if you're just looking at it as those technical details. And then this spec era that I imagine many of us are in some capacity, this is documenting those inputs and outputs. But not only that, but understanding why those matter, which is what we'll use to get from that spec era to the context stage that we're coming to. So no matter what stage you're at here, you can learn from all of the stages. You can pull it in here to this context stage of where we can go. APIs, we've learned today, can rent a car. And it might be scary for some of you, but they need a navigator. And I think that's all of us here. And so I invite you to get into that passenger seat and make sure that APIs have what they need, the information, the context that they need to be successful. Looking forward to it tomorrow and the next few years. Thanks.